Have you ever wondered why stories about the dark macabre or chilling events are fascinating? Well, I believe that some of us are hardwired to survive, and that wiring urges us to seek out information and share stories of events that others would consider unsettling. Perhaps you get a rush about a horrific event, but really it's just the insight about how to survive if ever the situation happened to you. And thankfully, that knowledge will help you feel empowered to make the right choices to keep yourself safe. This is my goal. Hello, my lovelies, and thank you for joining me. I'm Madam Roman. I discuss true crime, dark histories, mysteries, mayhem, and anything else that fascinates me. Sometimes I take a look at things from a different perspective. I like to delve into the possibilities of why things happen and why people do things. So if that's something that also interests you, put on your highest red bottom slippers and get ready to learn how to strut your stuff down the silver brick road to the land of wisdom. The following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. So, if you're not mature, step the fuck out of line because this shit is about to get real. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. On February 15th, 1939, Robert Hansen was born, making him an Aquarius sun. Now, according to his birth chart, he would tend to be described as someone clever, intelligent, cool, and calm, but does not like to follow the rules. He would have a rebellious streak and liked freedom, autonomy, control, and security. He would feel shame for wanting to be part of a community, team, or group, and would have extreme behavioral issues if this was denied. Challenged to solve problems, improve what's already working, and have amorous adventures and unusual pastimes requiring unconventional partners that would not limit his sexual expression. He would also be incredibly stubborn, and once believed something to be a certain way, he would be hard to be dissuaded. That would trigger a negative feedback loop of pessimism and dissatisfaction. These issues could lead to a double life. I'm not kidding you, that is actually what it says on his birth chart. For this man, it's very accurate. He was the first child of two to his father, Christian Chris, and mother, Edna. His father was a Danish immigrant who owned a bakery, but was a domineering, strict, and religious man. Robert's mother, Edna, was a homemaker and by all accounts a loving mother. Although, as Robert got older, he started to regard his mother as weak and submissive to his overbearing father. This would later lead to feelings that good women were submissive to men, and that men must be in control at all times. Unfortunately, Robert was not the strong, confident, handsome young man that his father had hoped for in a son. Instead, Robert was small, introverted, painfully shy, and socially awkward. And despite being left-handed, Chris forced Robert to use his right hand. As a baker, Chris worked very early hours in the morning, and Robert was made to work ridiculously long hours alongside him in the bakery before going to school each day. Robert was paid 35 cents to $1 per day, which he resented. But it was clear from a young age that Robert was good at one thing: killing. Robert's ability in hunting, fishing, and archery won him accolades from his friends, awards from competitions, and trophies that would hang in his home. His resentment continued at school when he was ridiculed for his awkwardness and shy demeanor, but also the terrible stutter that he had and the severe acne he had developed as a teen. Robert was teased, laughed at, and was the butt of jokes. But it was the ridicule from the girls in particular that made him feel inadequate and weak, leading him to even more anger and resentment. He seized that they had the power to make him feel inferior, and he would later say that he started to fantasize about raping and killing them. This resentment festered inside of him, and every slight became reason for retribution. From his misspelled name in the yearbook to the rejection of his peers, he used these as reasons for his lack of impulse control and bad behavior. It started after a year in the Army Reserves, where he first had a sexual experience with a prostitute. His first ever sexual experience was with a prostitute. He came back to Iowa to work in his father's bakery. He volunteered as a firefighter and was the drill instructor at the Army Reserve Military Police. He met a woman named Phoebe, and they were soon married. But something was unsettled in Robert. His resentment at not being treated the way he wanted by members of the town sparked the idea of setting fire to the school bus garage. But this was not just a small fire. It burned down half the building. And guess who was there to help fight the fire? The friend that had helped him burn down the building went to authorities, and when Robert was accused, his father defended him, telling everyone that he was framed. But then when plans of blowing up a tractor, a water tower, and the chief of police's house came to light, Chris could no longer defend Robert. With the revelation, Phoebe said, "Peace out, bitches," and left Robert. She had the brief marriage annulled. Smart girl. She saw the red flags. Chris and Edna couldn't take the humiliation. They sold the bakery, they bought a resort in Minnesota, and they moved. When charged with arson, Robert started the mental defective defense that he would claim in future legal cases, but was still sentenced to 3 years in prison. After serving only 20 months, he was released and moved to Minnesota to be with his parents. There he met Darla, who was working at his parents' resort. They genuinely liked each other, and they had many things in common. They both liked the outdoors, and they seemed to fall in love. In 1963, they married. She was an attractive, good woman, and was most of all smart and dedicated to her religion. She would earn a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree to become a special education teacher. But Robert's behavior didn't improve, and after a few years of continuous accusations against him of theft from his employers in various stores, she decided that instead of leaving Robert and divorcing, she would use her earnings to take care of the household expenses and the 2 children that they had had together. She would even take the children to her parents' house in the summer and holidays. It seemed Darla wanted to spend as little time with Robert as possible, and unfortunately, this only enabled Robert and gave him the freedom to do whatever he wanted. Robert also used his earnings from the bakery he had opened, and all his free times without the family around, to pursue his other interests. This arrangement gave him the cover of a family man, but none of the responsibility, which suited Robert just fine. After all, he seemed to view the marriage as a form of settling. Not that she settled for him, but that he settled for her. This fucker felt that he did not get what he deserved in a mate. He was upset that she was not to his standards of beauty like the girls in high school. Plus, he wanted things from a woman that were not proper for a lady. More likely, he knew that what he wanted was control, domination, and degradation of a woman, and he knew he couldn't do that with a woman like Darla. In 1971, Robert decided that his resentment and frustration was going to have a target. After moving to Anchorage, Alaska in 1967 with Darla for a fresh start, his first known attack occurred. In November in Seward, Alaska, as Susan, an 18-year-old, came to a stop while driving home, she noticed the driver in another car and gave a slight smile. That's all that Robert needed. Without her realizing it, he followed her home. He knocked on her apartment door and asked to use her phone, saying that his friend lived in the same complex and that he couldn't remember the building number and he needed to call him. After a few minutes of looking through the phone book kind of awkwardly, he asked Susan if she would like to go out with him. She let him know that she was engaged and he awkwardly left. It wasn't until days later, when Susan was getting out of her car at her apartment, that Robert attacked her at gunpoint and tried to kidnap her. Her screams alerted her roommate, who called the police. Robert was arrested, but released on bail. While on bail on December 19th, again in Seward, Alaska, he attacked, abducted, and raped Patricia Roberts. After hours, she was able to convince him to let her go, that she would not tell anyone. And she may never have, had the body of Celia Beth Van Zanten not been found on Christmas Day. 3 days after Patricia's horrific experience, Celia Beth Van Zanten went missing while walking to the store to get a soda. And sorry for my ADHD brain, but there's a difference between soda and pop, depending on where you live in the United States, which I think is fascinating. So I'm not sure if Alaska actually says soda or pop, but that's what I'm putting. Squirrel. She was found with her hands bound behind her back and naked from the waist down. The coroner determined that she had been sexually assaulted and was alive when she ended up down the hill. It looked as if she jumped out of a car to get away from her attacker, but because of her bindings, she couldn't get herself up the steep hill and died of exposure in the extreme Alaskan winter temperatures. She was 18 years old. Robert was not connected to Celia's death when the authorities decided to try him for the attack on Susan and Patricia at the same time. He was convicted of assault with a deadly weapon for Susan, but as a plea deal, the charges for Patricia were dropped. He was sentenced to 5 years, but only served 4 months, and then was transferred to a halfway house and then probation. And this is where we learn to say, what the fuck? Robert would later admit that with his attack on Patricia, he knew that if he let her go, he would be caught for the crime. My speculation, when he attacked Celia, which he never admitted to doing and is technically still unsolved, he knew that he would not be able to let her live. He knew that if he let her live, he would be caught. He knew that he would have to end her life to continue his sick crimes. But this doesn't account for the fact that he had been committing crimes for years with little to no repercussions, giving him the belief that he could do whatever he wanted and not get punished. He even started to realize that he was more likely to get away with his crimes when he chose prostitutes as his victims. Getting caught was the excuse to elevate the game to a new, more exciting level without having to take any responsibility. It was not until the very early hours of June 13th, 1983, that the evolution of his crimes would be told. A young child of 17 was seen by a man driving in a truck. Half naked, no shoes, handcuffed, she was frantic and terrified. When he pulled over and she got into the truck, she told the driver there was a man chasing her with a gun. The driver saw the man running toward them with a gun and sped off. He wanted to take the girl to the police, but she refused. She just wanted to be dropped off at the motel that she was staying at. So he did. Her name was Cindy Paulson. His name is Robert Paulson. Sorry. And she would be the one to take down a sadistic, prolific serial killer. For 12 years, Robert Hansen had been kidnapping, raping, and sometimes murdering women in Alaska without concern, remorse, or detection. In fact, Robert had the reputation of a family man, and with his bakery, he would deliver donuts to the police officers, ingratiating himself in their good graces. But it was not even until the body of an unidentified woman was found in 1980 by Powerline utility workers near Eklutna Road that there was even a suspicion that there could be a number of women missing. The woman had been stabbed in the back and buried in a shallow grave. Because of the clothing that was found with her body, it was suspected that she was a sex worker. The woman could not be identified because of the state of decomposition and the lack of information, so she was named Eklutna Annie for the location where she was found. It was with finding this woman's body that Detective Maxine Farrell took note of how many women were missing in the area. But because these women lived transient lives as sex workers, it was hard to track, so her hunch couldn't be confirmed. I do find interesting that in my research, it was the male investigators who got most of the glory, and Detective Maxine Farrell wasn't mentioned very much at all. Alaska had gone through a huge boom with pipeline dollars adding to the local economy. It drew many men to work in the jobs that the pipeline brought about, and like other times in history, and this kind of circumstances presents, crime usually follows. Organized crime syndicates started to flood the area with drugs and prostitution to fuel the appetites of those workers. They would get young, vulnerable women hooked on drugs or promise of big money, and when the women got there, the syndicates would charge them for their travel, housing, and living expenses. The money that the women earned from sex work would go to the pimp in charge, and little would make it to the workers. I should say the sex workers. The syndicate would also rotate the women between Portland, Seattle, and Anchorage. In combination with the fact that sex workers tend to use aliases that change, it's hard to track if the women were disappearing or just moving. There was also the stigma of these women as prostitutes. Society was not concerned with the safety of these women because it was concluded that if a woman chose to live such a lifestyle, then she deserved whatever happened to her. It also didn't help that the police force had suffered a huge loss when officers would resign to work as security guards at the pipeline for much greater pay. September 1982, 2 off-duty police officers, when hunting along the Kinnick River, discovered a woman's body along the bank in a shallow grave. She was identified as Sherry Morrow, who was a topless dancer that had last been seen in November before and had been missing since. She had been shot in the back 3 times, and the .223 cartridges had been found near her body. Surprisingly, the clothes that she had been wearing did not have bullet holes in them, which indicated to investigators that she was actually naked when she was shot and redressed before being buried. She was 23 years old. The discovery of Sherry Morrow was the confirmation that Detective Farrell needed to take her suspicions to her supervisors, but they didn't listen. After the driver of the truck that had picked her up while she was running, frantically trying to get away from the man with the gun, dropped Cindy off at the motel, he went to the police. The police then went and found Cindy. She told him her harrowing story. She described that a man had picked her up for a sex act for $200. While in the car with him, he drew a gun and handcuffed her. He took her back to his home, which she described in great detail. The stuffed animals hanging on the walls, the bearskin rug that he raped her on, the bullet hole in the floor, his name, and the location of his house. Cindy told them that after hours of keeping her chained by the throat during the night, the man stated that he was going to take her on his plane to his cabin and then bring her back when he was done with her, like the 7 other women that he had taken there. She knew that she could not get on that plane with him. She knew that he killed those 7 other women, and that if she went with him, he would kill her too. She knew that she had to escape, but in the meantime, she was going to remember as much as she could so that she could lead the police to him. Cindy was not going to let this man get away with this. You don't like this? I know. Okay. Her insistence that she take the police to the airport so she can ID the man's plane and to the location of his house were crucial in putting Robert Hansen on police radar. She was determined that this man not get away with what he did to her or the other women that he had or would have killed. It was unfortunate that the authorities did not take any evidence in any crime that Cindy had accused Robert of. No photos of her injuries, no photos of his house, and no photos of his physical state. When police questioned Robert regarding Cindy's claims, Robert leaned hard into the "I'm an upstanding family man and member of the community" bit, and the societal misogyny that he knew would allow the police to believe his version of events rather than that of a prostitute. He also had 2 of his friends lie to provide alibis. I wonder what those men were thinking when being asked to lie for someone accused of such crimes, and how they felt when it came to light that he had been a monster. Almost 3 months later, the body of Paula Goulding was found by 2 boys hunting along the Connect River, not far from Sherry Morrow. With such similar MO as the other victims, it was no longer possible for the police force to ignore the fact these women were not just missing, but being murdered. It was then that a task force was formed by the Alaska State Troopers. The information that Detective Farrow had gathered, in addition to the information about Robert Hansen's past convictions and, at the time, alleged assault against Cindy Paulson, were handed to the Alaska State Troopers. It was with the AST that the shell casings from each of the burial sites were connected and found to be all from the same weapon. Authorities were now looking for a serial killer. The AST were able to get a FBI profiler, John Douglas, to assess the profile of the serial killer. Douglas believed that the killer would have low self-esteem, be an excellent hunter that would keep souvenirs, have a history of rejection by women, own a plane, and have a stutter. Lead detective in the case, Detective Floth, was convinced Robert Hansen was the killer. With the FBI profile, Paulson's testimony, and the evidence that Hansen had committed insurance fraud, because all those trophies that were in his house, he had claimed that they were stolen, and he filed an insurance claim and he'd used the insurance money to open the bakery. But now police knew that that insurance claim was false, so it was fraud, insurance fraud. A search warrant was issued. The search was proving unsuccessful when at the last moment an officer was told to go check the attic of the house. When he reported that there was nothing but insulation, he was told to pull it up and look. As he did, a cache of evidence was found: jewelry, IDs of women, and weapons. One weapon that was found in particular was a .223, the same weapon that had killed the found victims. Additionally, a map was found behind Hansen's headboard. It was an aviation map and contained dozens of X marks, some in similar locations to those of the locations where the bodies were found. Robert Hansen realized he was caught. He was not going to get out of this one. For the last time, he made a plea deal. Robert realized the insurmountable evidence against him. He confessed to the murders of 17 women and children, and the rape of 30 women. As part of the agreement, he would only be charged with 4 murders, and would lead police to the locations of the rest of the bodies that were on the map. To this day, 5 of those women still have not been found. While incarcerated, Robert was quick to differentiate the only women that he killed were the ones that he thought deserved it. Women that worked as sex workers that fought him, angered him, or humiliated him were the ones that he hunted and killed. Robert was fascinated with sex workers and felt that they had power that they shouldn't, and they needed to be abused so that he could have the power instead. He would not confess to the murders of the women that were not sex workers, like Celia Beth Van Zatten in 1971, or 17-year-old Megan Emick in 1973, or 23-year-old Mary Thill in 1975. That would be an admission of some other kind of depravity that he could not face. Robert Hansen died of natural causes in 2014 at the age of 75. In 2021, after 37 years, one of Robert Hansen's victims was finally identified through a DNA database. The victim, only known as Horseshoe Harriet, was identified as Robin Pelkey. Even after several attempts to determine her identification through facial recognition, Eklutna Annie is still unidentified. I would like to mention that once again, this man was able to commit these horrific acts on women and children, primarily because he chose his victims from a population that is devalued by society. Most analysis, books, and studies into these predators is done trying to determine why or how these killers came to be. It's always abuse, trauma, and a domineering mother, etc. One is hard-pressed to find that society itself plays an enormous role in the cause of the misogyny and vile behavior that prevails in these men. And in that theory, an example of such a misuse of privilege is one of the authors that covered Robert Hansen's crimes. A man that has, it seems, made a career of the spectacle of the details and his own interjections. Interjections that, to me, show just how privilege can cloud decent judgment. The author remarks on his website when talking about Cindy agreeing to a sex act for $200 with Robert. It's, quote, "Put me in parent mode. Sure, you're worth it, I want to tell her. Not everyone gets an offer like that. Then I want to admonish her. But Cindy, listen. That's way too much for a blowjob in a car. This guy isn't to be trusted. Perfect parental hindsight." End quote. There's so much there, I'm not sure where to start. So he just stated that she's worth fellatio for $200 with an adult, a child. That she's lucky to have such a great offer. Or perhaps not in a car, so maybe a hotel would be better. And that he wants to admonish her? Nothing about the fact that she's a child having to perform a sex act on a stranger to survive. Nothing about how society threw her away and doesn't care that she has no choices, that her pimp will likely beat her for not bringing enough money that day. I'm hoping most parents that would hear a statement like that would feel a shiver along their spine, knowing that it's creepy in the guise of parenthood. So what pearls of wisdom have we gleaned today? Number 1, listen to your gut and trust your instincts. They are there for your survival. Like Cindy, she trusted her instincts. She knew Robert would not let her live despite what he said. Number 2, know your exits. She planned an escape, and when she saw the opportunity, she had the courage to make it happen. Please let me know if you have any comments or questions down below. I'm always interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you for watching, and be safe. And as always, sending you silver streaks of wisdom.